Hello everybody and welcome to today's Dead by Daylight Tyde Talk. Today we'll be covering one of the more powerful perks for Survivor known as Sprint Burst. Similar to other powerful perks, Sprint Burst had a godlike start and over time found itself at the mercy of several changes. Today we'll be talking about the history and its place in the current meta. As always, we begin at the release of Dead by Daylight. Sprint Burst was a teachable, known from Meg, that would allow survivors to move at a 150% movement speed for 3 seconds when sprinting. This perk would enter a 20-second cooldown before it would be able to take effect again. If you're not familiar with the start of the game, let me just tell you how powerful this was. Being one of the few godlike perks for survivors at the start of the game, Sprint Burst was an extremely powerful chase perk as it made infinite loops extremely easy to reach and allowed chases to last so long, survivors were able to avoid damage during the entire game and escape. What made that so powerful was the fact that Sprint Burst would reset every 20 seconds. This included while you were being chased and running. So while in chase, every 20 seconds you just get a massive boost of speed, making a decent gap between you and the killer. Not to mention that you had massive loops on every map that Sprint Burst only made worse. When the killer thought they might have the hit and went for the swing, Survivor would just abruptly pick up pace because Sprint Burst activated. It was one of the 4 godlike meta perks at the release of the game, and we've recently covered one other known as Self-Care. These perks were the primary choice, and if you had all 4, you were the ultimate survivor. Similar to other previous overpowered perks we've had on Tyde Talks, we'd see a quick change within 15 days of release to Sprint Burst in patch 1.0.2. This patch would remedy several issues with survivors that made them unstoppable. Sprint Burst would now have its cooldown doubled to 40 seconds. This would help remedy some of the issue as it would make it possible to get a hit within a chase since the survivor would no longer get it so frequently. But that did not remove Sprint Burst from its spot on everyone's build when possible. Sprint Burst would continue to be a problem for Dead by Daylight, and it wouldn't be until about half a year later in patch 1.3.0 that we would see a more manageable change. Or so the developers thought. Sprint Burst would now have a change that slows down the 40-second cooldown to 80 seconds while sprinting. If you walked or crouched, it would recover at the normal 40-second speed. This would be another attempt to prevent Sprint Burst from activating in chase as often as it was, but it would not eliminate the problem completely. Due to how many large loops and pallets that were available at the time, it was still easy to run the killer for 80 seconds. But this wasn't the only issue that kept Sprint Burst as a core perk for every build. During patch 1.3.0, they would introduce a speed boost effect to Balanced Landing. Originally, Balanced Landing was only there to counter the stun you get from falling off heights. And we'll be familiar with this mechanic in today's game, as it is what we use today. Balanced Landing would be the counter to that stun effect from the fall, but ever since 1.3.0, it would also be another exhaustion perk that we have to choose from. Though originally Balanced Landing was not introduced as a speed boost effect, it did eventually become one. Both Sprint Burst and Balanced Landing were their own perks though, and there was no such thing as exhaustion at the time. Instead, each perk would individually go on cooldown when used. Therefore, you could use Sprint Burst to get away from the killer, and as that perk cooled down, you could use Balanced Landing to give yourself a second speed boost effect. Both cooldowns would happen independently, so you could effectively ignore the double timer on Sprint Burst with Balanced Landing. Patch 1.3.0 was meant to fix the issues with Sprint Burst, but happened to make the situation worse since 2 speed boost effects could be used more often than before. This was the peak of problems as it seemed the balance was not going to be achieved. It was then 4 months after that we would finally see Dead by Daylight work its way out of the dark times. Patch 1.5.0 would release and fix several issues coming from the one-sided strength of survivors. During this patch, we would see the introduction to new HUD effects that allow survivors to see what status they're afflicted with. Perks would also be granted some of these status effects in place of their own individual cooldowns, and Sprint Burst would change its own cooldown to applying exhaustion to the survivors for 40 seconds. Additionally, exhaustion would carry on the sprint burst effect. It would recover at half speed while running, but could also be reduced by 33% while crouching. This ultimately prevented the combo of multiple speed boost effects such as balance landing and sprint burst. That helped quite a bit in terms of strength of combining both perks, but it was still possible at the time to get 2 sprint bursts in a single chase, making it frustrating for killers. Then came patch 1.8.0, where they would remove the accelerating recovery of crouching from exhaustion, and in patch 2.1.0, they removed the ability to recover exhaustion while sprinting. Now, exhaustion will be completely halted while the survivor is sprinting. With these changes, we would finally see sprint burst slowly fade from every build in the game. The value of the perk heavily lost its potential after it could no longer be procced more than once per chase. With that, we find sprint burst to be in the state it is for today. So how is it in the current meta? Sprint burst is still a useful perk, granting a survivor a boost to speed at the start of their sprint. However, in comparison to its release, it is far less useful, and has been well balanced since then. Sprint burst has less use now, as it serves as a more consistent speed boost effect in the game. Due to this, it does compete with several other perks for the exhaustion slot in a build. Sprint burst does not combine well with any other exhaustion effect since it has no requirement that prevents it from activating. Other speed boost perks have a condition that must be met in order to activate, which allows you to control it to some degree when they activate and apply exhaustion to you, whereas sprint burst activates immediately and prevents you from using any of the other exhaustion perks. Balance landing would be one of the few exceptions, being you could walk off of a ledge and then get the speed boost effect, but you'd also get that the moment that you sprinted. Balance landing does still mix, although you'd mostly be using it for the reduction in stun from falling rather than the speed boost effect. With that being said, sprint burst has fallen out of favor as many exchange it for other exhaustion perks such as balance landing, dead hard, or lithe. Exhaustion perks are an important part of today's meta, and you would typically only choose one at a time. No exhaustion perk is a bad choice, but each one fits a different playstyle. Sprint burst may no longer be the top pick for every build, but it does its job well and is still a viable pick, although not the most popular anymore. As of now, the perk is well balanced and not likely to see further changes, ending the journey of sprint burst here. Did you experience sprint burst at the game's release? Do you remember how powerful it was? And did you by chance ever keep track of how many times you got it to work in a single chase? Share your experiences down below. Personally, I've changed my exhaustion perk to be balanced landing, as I've liked to take loops based on the hills and buildings rather than trying to run away from a close encounter. If you like the Tyde Talk, please give this video a like and share it with a friend. I'll be working to get more done soon to cover the much requested dark times of Dead by Daylight. We'll get to that chapter as soon as we wrap up the perks related to it, as they did make a massive impact. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and as always, good game.